Sir, you are live. You can start now.
Okay. Welcome everybody to today's webinar number 49, Young India Intensivist. And today's webinar is on a very important topic, COVID, and it's basics of COVID, clinical features and treatment. And amongst clinical features is going to be lungs, the most important thing, and it's been talked about by none other than Professor Khilani sir, our renowned pulmonologist, and I don't think there's anyone better than him to talk about it, lungs and COVID. And then I will talk about the extrapulmonary effects, and then ma'am, Dr. Professor Villa Chaco will talk about the treatment. So you may wonder why we did not have a COVID seminar till now. Because you see, we did cover it to some extent, but now that the data is out, things about the lungs are clear, the ventilation, etc. That's why we did not have it. So I will request Dr. Khilani sir to introduce the topic and then to start his talk, COVID and the lungs.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Tapesh, for a kind introduction and also inviting me to talk on this subject, the Young India Intensivist. I know I am happy to be among the young intensivists. And what he has asked me to talk about is COVID and lung. And I don't know where to start and where to end. So I thought 1/3 of the time I'll spend on acute COVID, that is pneumonia, and then I'll spend more time on post-COVID lung, which is actually more important to me today as compared to the acute COVID, because as far as northern India is concerned, we seem to be in the comfort zone for the time being. And this was on the 25th January, when we were in the comfort zone, when I was delivering a lecture on API forum. Then I thought that probably we are sitting on a time bomb. And another API meeting was held in April 2021 when this bomb had already exploded. The question is that, are we sitting on a time bomb again? Is this comfort zone that we are enjoying is going to continue for long? Probably the answers are not there. But as far as India is concerned, there are 3,31,00,000 people who have recovered from COVID, which is actually underestimated because these are the ones who are tested. And we know that actual number is much, much higher. We have only 18% who are fully vaccinated till last night. And at least about 50% have received at least one dose. So that's a very welcome thing which has happened. But if you look at the USA, who had started vaccinating in the month of much earlier than us, in November, and they are quite well vaccinated. More than 50% adults were vaccinated almost 1.5 months back. And 13th of May, they stopped mask mandate when there were cases were less than 10,000. And now the cases have risen to 1,50,000 a day. On some days, the number of cases have actually gone above 2 lakhs a day. So there could be various causes for that. Vaccine hesitancy is one, but other main cause, which is not the topic of the subject today, that after the vaccination, there's a definite waning of immunity, roughly to the tune of 6% per month. So that's why this, and of course, the stopping the COVID appropriate behavior, opening everything, has led United States and other countries back in trouble. And so therefore still they are struggling with COVID. But what we are discussing today is managing COVID pneumonia. As I said at the outset, that I would be spending more time on post-COVID and less time on acute COVID because we are not seeing so much. So I'll start with the case, a 62 years old male who presented with fever, sore throat, headache for one day. He was fever, he had heart rate of 92 with SpO2 of 96 on room air, and this was the CT, which was then. You can see the ground glass opacity at that time. This was during the much before the first wave, actually, at the beginning, maybe the April, May of last year. So On day 6 of illness, another CT was done because he was a radiologist, so he got another CT done. And you can see the ground glass opacity increase. If it was during the second wave, we would have immediately made a diagnosis even on the first wave. So on the sixth day, that is sixth day of illness, he was diagnosed as COVID positive by RT-PCR. He had lymphopenia. He had lymphocytes of 13%. Ferritin was high, and CRP was still normal. So he had acute COVID. The treatment options, what we have in acute pneumonia, several of them. We tried hydroxychloroquine, we tried ivermectin, we tried, but what I'll be discussing is antiviral steroids and immune modulators, anticoagulation, and I'll omit these therapies which have a questionable efficacy. And of course, doxycycline I'll be not be talking about. So remdesivir came in big controversy. It is an active metabolite which inhibits RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, and its role in the replication of a broad range of viruses, including coronaviridae, is now established. So this was the Gillard trial, where the median recovery time was 11 days in remdesivir as compared to 15 days in the placebo group, which was significant without any mortality benefit. So therefore, in the May 2020, FDA gave an emergency use authorization. Subsequently, the solidarity trial by WHO showed that there was absolutely no benefit of remdesivir, and they said no. The remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine do not work. But subsequently, in October 22nd, the FDA approved remdesivir and they thought that it is a step in the right direction, and the indication also expanded. So currently the recommendation is that FDA has approved for hospitalized children more than 12 years of and adults, regardless of severity. And Ministry of Health, Government of India said it may be considered in patients within 10 days of onset of symptoms with moderate to severe disease. So this is the only antiviral drug so far which has been found to be effective. Briefly talking about corticosteroids, the recovery trial, a randomized trial, open label trial showed that dexamethasone 6 mg led to significant reduction in mortality. And this was statistically, we all know about it. And these are the results of recovery trial, which I don't have time to go into detail. So this was a game changer. So patients who had hypoxemia, patients who were with bilateral pneumonia, patients who were sick in the ICU or in the wards started receiving dexamethasone. So the question is, which sort? So subsequently there was a meta-analysis of 7 randomized trials with 1,700 patients, and it was associated with lower 28 days all-cause mortality. We are quite used to using methylprednisolone, Solimedrol being commercial name. Is it prednisolone, dexamethasone, or hydrocortisone? Which one is better? Now, the meta-analysis which I referred to suggested that dexamethasone was better than hydrocortisone was better than methylprednisolone. In that order, the initial duration recommended was 10 days as per the recovery trial. However, it may be continued for 2 to 3 weeks in tapering dosages in the post-discharge if the person extensive lung involvement. Of course, you know all this. I'll have to go through quickly to anticoagulation. It improves the outcome, including the survival, and no molecular heparin is the drug of choice. And enoxaparin is preferred in daily dosages. Then the question came whether we should give therapeutic dose or give standard prophylactic dose, and this was a multi-center RCT where enoxaparin was tried in 2 dosages and 1 dosages, and it was found that there was no additional benefit of giving therapeutic dosages. So therefore, once a day dose of enoxaparin is sufficient. So this patient became better, but on the day 5th of admission, an increased requirement of oxygen support. He was put in COVID ICU with 15 liters of oxygen. All biomarkers, including CRP, D-dimer, and IL-6, were raised, and this was a CT on the 15th day. You need see that ground glass opacities have increased. So, are there any other therapies which can be given? Are there therapies of remdesivir is fine, anticoagulation is fine, steroids are standard of practice. Convalescent plasma we used during the first wave, but subsequent randomized trial dumped it. So it was discerned, and finally, the Government of India Ministry of Health also recommended not to use convalescent plasma for therapy. It doesn't have any role. However, there is a role of some other therapy like IL-6, anti-IL-6, that is tocilizumab. The randomized trials have shown benefit with that. So, patient on 24th day was shifted to the ward and was weaned off from oxygen support, even was discharged on oral steroids and anticoagulant, and RT-PCR was negative. So now I'll come to the topic which I am going to describe in greater detail is post-lung involvement, that is fibrosis. And everybody is dreadful of this complication. And this was a study which, this was an autopsy study from the people who unfortunately died, 38 from Italy and 10 from Germany. What they found was that there was fibrin thrombi, indicative of coagulopathy in small arterial vessel of some of these patients, and you can see fibrosed lungs. And what they found that in the early phase, that is 7 to 10 days, there was diffuse alveolar damage. At the same time, they also saw fibrous tissue as early as in first 7 to 10 days. These are autopsy studies. In the organizing stage, there was fibrous organization, including fibroblastic proliferation and type 2 pneumocytic hyperplasia. And late stage, that is fibrotic stage, the lungs exhibit dense septal and alveolar fibrosis. So therefore, there is an autopsy evidence, histological evidence, that fibrosis sets in much earlier in these patients who have COVID, severe COVID pneumonia. But how does it affect physiologically? Post-COVID pneumonia, 47% had impaired diffusion capacity for carbon monoxide. 25% had reduction in total lung capacity and also vital capacity on PVT. So therefore, the long-term follow-up is definitely required. And who is likely to develop fibrosis? The one who are elderly, the one who have severe illness, those who have prolonged ICU or hospital stay and mechanical ventilation, those who have history of smoking or alcoholism, those who have high CRP and IL-6 during ICU stay. And it is too soon to determine which patient in COVID-19 are at greatest risk. So only the studies would say. So if diagrammatically there is acute and chronic inflammation, as you can see, there is alveolar epithelial damage, followed by overexpression of pro-inflammatory cytokines, the TGF-beta and the TNF IL-6. And then finally the fibroblast and myofibroblast activation is there, and excessive deposition of collagen leads to lung fibrosis. If you want to see that on a CT scan, this is the first stage where there is ground glassing opacity, which we think is reversible. There is a second stage where this ground glass opacity is increased, but there is little amount of fibrotic strands that you can see, but you can't be sure. The third stage, now you can see interstitial thickening has already started occurring, and finally it goes into fibrosis, and you can see traction bronchiectasis like this. So therefore, it's a progressive. Can we stop this progress, and what can we do about it? So detail that I will be discussing it by showing some cases. This is a 47 years old male, diabetic, fever for 10 days. He had COVID, he had hypoxemia. Provisional diagnosis was severe acute respiratory illness, possibly COVID-19. He was diagnosed COVID-19, and CT chest was done, which showed the following picture, as you can see. And he was given oxygen, tocilizumab, convalescent plasma therapy, repeat RT-PCR after 14 days came out to be negative. 7 days after discharge, he went home, but he came back with this fibrotic disease. The question is, his repeat RT-PCR was positive, and when he came with the breathlessness, he developed pneumothorax. So this is a common complication of COVID that we have seen. Sometimes we have seen bilateral pneumothorax without any positive pressure ventilation. Patients are presented with bilateral pneumothorax, but this patient has unilateral pneumothorax. So a pigtail insertion was done, and patient improved and was sent home. However, after 6 weeks, he came with breathlessness. He was already on oxygen, and you can see interstitial fibrosis. And the question is, how do we manage such patients? Should these patients receive corticosteroid? Should these patients receive anticoagulation? Should we give antifibrotic medication? When to give? Whether to give nintedanib, whether to give pirfenidone? All these things we'll be talking about. So this is another lady, 34 years old female, unmarried, no comorbidities except obesity, belong to the high socioeconomic status. On 26th April, she had fever, body ache, was RT-PCR positive. On 9th day, admitted with low oxygen saturation, put on NRBM, received remdesivir steroids, discharged after 21st day of illness on tapering doses of corticosteroids. On 40th day, SpO2 was 93% on 2 to 3 liters. And she was, when I actually seen her on a video call, she was unable to go to washroom because of severe proximal muscle weakness. Now, I would like your attention on this CT scan which was done on 22nd day of illness while she was in hospital. You can see whole lung parenchyma is involved. There is consolidation. There is pneumomediastinum that you can see. And there seems to be a, some suggestion of bronchiectasis, which one can't be sure. Her score as given by the radiologist was 25/25 on that day, and she was on high flow oxygen with NRBM at that time. And you can see here bronchogram and pneumomediastinum. So on 40th day, when I saw her, her TLC was 10,600, her CRP was 18, her D-dimer was 2050. The choice was, should I give her steroids, continue with steroid? What should I do with anticoagulant? Is it time to start antifibrotics? So, if I give anticoagulant, should it be newer oral anticoagulant or it should be aspirin? And for how long? If I give antifibrotic, should be pirfenidone or nintedanib. So, on 62nd day, so what I did was I did not start her on steroids as I didn't think there was an evidence of fibrosis. So I continued on tapering dosages of steroids. She started going to washroom on 62nd day. She was requiring oxygen only for going to washroom. She had severe fatigue. There was leukocytosis. D-dimer has come down to 1200. CRP became normal and ferritin was 16.9. So, on 75th day, she came to the OPD, was able to walk few steps. She was not requiring oxygen. She had proximal muscle weakness. SpO2 was 98%. TLC was close to normal. D-dimer was still high and CRP was 21. And when I did the CT on the 75th day of illness, this was the CT, and I was pleasantly amazed all the consolidation was gone except a few shadows here. And if you see on 16th May, she had pneumomediastinum with a score of 24/5/25. On 10th July, she had this kind of CT scan. And on 7th August, that is almost 25 days later, she herself drove from Sonipat to Delhi. Her PFT was normal and DLCO showed mild impairment and she was not on active treatment. What I'm trying to emphasize on you that there could be a case of starting early antifibrotic drugs based on the CT score of 25/25 and requirement of oxygen. But one has to make judgment based on the CT picture and the progress which I will be talking about. There was another case of 44 years old male who had fever, cough for 5 days, developed difficulty in breathing on 12th day of illness. He had SpO2 of 91 on 3 liters and had bilateral creptation. Now you can see the CT on 12th of May 2021. There is a consolidation with air bronchogram and lower cut show further denser consolidation and further lower cut also show consolidation. So he received steroid, remdesivir, anticoagulation, required oxygen by nasal prong, CRP was high, CLC was also high, D-dimer was also high. On 26th of June, this was the CT scan. Now, here is you can see the interstitial thickening, interstitial fibrosis. There is bronchiectasis, traction bronchiectasis. There is no question that this patient has pulmonary fibrosis, and you can see the enlarged picture. This is traction bronchiectasis. This is interstitial thickening. You don't see any ground glassing. Only thickening is there. So he is clearly the candidate for antifibrotic drug. So he was on nintedanib, 150 milligram twice a day on 1 liter of oxygen. He is able to sit in bed. He was on 5 milligram of prednisolone and nintedanib. Question is how long to continue nintedanib. Another patient, 72 years old male who is father of my colleague nephrologist, himself a laboratory technician. He had COVID in the April, and this was a CT scan. He was requiring oxygen off and on. He had history of pneumomediastinum, but by 16 July, his CT was almost cleared. There are some ground glassing. He is able to walk, go for half an hour walk. And I'll show you radiologies of some more cases. This is classical signature X-ray, and this is the ground glassing which I have already shown you, and this is the interstitial thickening. Now this could be because of the fluid overload. This is in the COVID case. Initially we thought that this kind of shadows would require, we will go into fibrosis and we need to give antifibrotic drugs to them, but to our pleasant surprise, this kind of shadows disappear. And this is organizing pneumonia, which is seen in some cases of, you can see the air bronchogram. These also tend to disappear with treatment and time. So the question is when to start, how do we manage post-COVID pulmonary fibrosis? Now this is a dreadful disease, fibrotic NSIP, which pulmonologists are actually very scared to touch. Because this is relentlessly progressive, the response is not so good. It's a progressive interstitial lung disease. And what to talk of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis? If you go to Google, all of our patients go to Google and tell us that okay, they are only 2 to 3 years on an average left with them. How should they plan their future? Because both the NSIP and IPF are progressive diseases. So if you talk about idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, which is the main prototype of interstitial lung disease, the medical fraternity has been struggling. In 2000, when we read our textbook of respiratory medicine, the steroids were the standard of care. steroid with cytotoxic drugs, cyclophosphamide. People also use anticoagulation. Then people started using steroid with cytotoxic with N-acetylcysteine became standard of care. And then came Raghu's trial, Ganesh Raghu's trial, triple therapy. The Raghu's trial was the above trial. Then in the Panther trial, they showed that triple therapy arm of steroid, azathioprine, NAC was stopped early. So triple therapy also did not work. And then people tried etanercept, bosentan, interferon, sildenafil, imatinib. Nothing worked. It was only in the 2014 when the trial showed that pirfenidone and nintedanib by Capacity 1 and 2 Ascent trial and Impulses trial, they showed that both pirfenidone and nintedanib reduce the progression of the disease. They don't improve the disease, they reduce the decline in lung function. And I was there in 2014 attending the annual conference of American Thoracic Society, and medical fraternity were ecstatic. They thought that magic drugs have come because it's the first time in the history that true drugs were approved on the basis of randomized controlled trial, that was pirfenidone and nintedanib. So pirfenidone is a TGF beta collagen. It stimulates the collagen, inhibits the collagen synthesis, but it has an adverse effect of rash, photosensitivity, nausea, LFT derangement, and the dose is 2,403 milligrams, which rarely our patients actually tolerate. So what it does is that the reduction in forced vital capacity. So all these patients with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, with the course of time, there was a diminution in forced vital capacity. However, the diminution was much more in the placebo arm. So as I said, they reduce the decline in FVC. So similarly, nintedanib, it's a tyrosine kinase inhibitor. People started using it in cancer, but it was not so useful. But this also, the Impulses trial showed that it reduces the decline in vital capacity to the tune of 150, 125.3 ml, and this was statistically significant. Nintedanib is notorious for causing diarrhea in up to 60% of patients as per the study, but somehow in Indian patients, our experience is that it does not cause that much diarrhea. Subsequently, when it was another study, census trial came. Now this is the NSIP pattern in a patient with scleroderma, which is a dreadful disease, a common cause of interstitial lung disease. The census trial also showed that when nintedanib was given to patients with other interstitial lung disease, interstitial fibrosis, I would say, other than idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, it had similar effect of reducing the decline in forced vital capacity. So that stimulated the scientific community to start using pirfenidone as well as nintedanib for treatment of fibrosis secondary to COVID infection. The question was when to use. Should we use it when the patient in the ICU, or should we use it when patients come back? And I'll talk about it later. Is there a role of steroids in post-COVID patients? The recommendation is that steroids should be continued on discharge if the CT scan prior to discharge continues to show significant GGOs and patient is hypoxic. One. The caution against the use of large doses of oral steroids as they could worsen hyperglycemia. And as in my patient, she had such a severe proximal muscle weakness that she couldn't even sit and couldn't go to the washroom. And the recommendation dose is not more than 20 to 30 milligram of prednisolone at discharge in the tapering dosages. Is there a role of anticoagulation on long-term basis? There are two issues. You can give anticoagulation as a VTE prophylaxis as using normal tools. We give all the time in the patients who are bed bound. But is there a role of anticoagulation in patients who otherwise do not warrant prophylaxis? So although no data specific to COVID is present, but up to 45 days of prophylaxis should be considered for low bleeding risk patients at elevated VT risk due to reduced mobility or comorbidities such as active cancer. So it should not be routinely given. We, in our practice in severe patients, did give newer oral anticoagulant for a period of 2 weeks and then monitored it with D-dimer, but not that every patient with high D-dimer requires anticoagulation. Finally, how to follow these patients up? Pulmonary function, DLCO and 6-minute walk test are very important follow-up of these patients. The 6-minute walk test in our practice is very useful for assessing the pulmonary fibrosis in these patients. PFT, vital capacity, is most important parameter, but in our experience, DLCO is better correlated with lung involvement in post-COVID patients. Finally, what can we do? The steroids have very little role. Pirfenidone would reduce the decline in pulmonary function. The lifestyle modification is extremely important. The breathing exercises, the incentive spirometry, the yoga, especially Anulom Vilom, Bastrika, Kapal Bharati and Brahmari. These are the 4 pranayams to my mind. So any kind of breathing exercise you do is okay. Which exercise not to do? The heavy exercise is big no. Weightlifting, jogging, people have dropped dead while doing exercise. So gentle exercise should be done. Only after 8 weeks one should venture into doing heavier exercises. So concluding my talk, lung involvement, of course, we are in India, we are sort of away from acute COVID, but I have talked about that remdesivir is still useful drug. Big yes for corticosteroids. Big yes for anticoagulation. Big yes for interleukin antagonists. Big no for any kind of plasma therapy. I have not talked about IVIG, but of course there is a role of monoclonal antibodies, not in acute care, but in the early stages, which was not the subject. But as far as the lung fibrosis is concerned, it is a dreaded complication. An assessment is best done by oxygen requirement, PFT, DLCO and 6-minute walk test, of which DLCO and 6-minute walk test are very important. Steroids have role in early stages, especially when inflammatory markers are high. There is no role of long-term anticoagulants for fibrosis, and role of antifibrotic is being investigated. We don't have any head-to-head or any randomized trial which has shown that nintedanib or pirfenidone or any other drug retards the fibrosis or reduces, but only the time will tell whether the benefit which we have in IPF or other ILDs is also true for post-COVID lung involvement. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and I will be very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, sir, for your talk on post-COVID fibrosis and its dreadful complications. Just, sir, coming to the the ICU part, when the patient is actually in the ICU, a lot of data is now emerged. Is there and if so, what are the differences between COVID and non-COVID ARDS, sir, in terms of their physiology when they present?
So, Tapesh, initially it was thought that COVID is a ARDS with high compliance as compared to the usual ARDS because of either bacterial infection or other causes. So it was initially thought that low PEEP is required for this was initial thinking, and later on, after 2 weeks, that ARDS will be as ARDS of any other. But this actually there is no study to show that the altered strategy of mechanical ventilation works better in these patients. So I would say that if you talk about ARDS, but here I would like to add that the PF ratio of 200 which we or 150 which we take for starting the mechanical ventilation and usual ARDS, we did not follow for COVID. Even patient with PF ratio of less than 100, we tried to manage it with high flow nasal cannula and non-invasive ventilation. Here I would also like to emphasize that certain differences in the management of ARDS in the ICU setting. The non-invasive ventilation, which had a questionable benefit in ARDS, and it was always a subject of pro-con debate for hypoxemic respiratory failure, we found it eminently useful for patients with COVID. Other thing is that high flow nasal cannula and the NIV were always a pro-con debate subject, but in COVID we used it both. What we did that we were using it alternately. When the patient was getting tired, if the PCO2 was rising and pH was dropping, then we used the non-invasive ventilation, and after a few hours, when the person became claustrophobic, we started using high flow nasal cannula, which we use it alternatively. Other thing which we found out that the prone positioning was much more useful in COVID ARDS as compared to the previous one. And in that case, I must say that it was easier to use prone positioning while using high flow nasal cannula as compared to non-invasive ventilation. But in both the prone positioning or even putting the patient on sides helped in averting the intubation, because
Looks like sir's internet has gone off.
I don't know what is happening. So I'll just take this forward while Sir reconnects. Like Sir said, the compliance is actually more in the COVID ARDS initially at least, and they have a high compliance. Even it has been shown in studies that for COVID ARDS, for the same PF ratio, the compliance is more as compared to non-COVID ARDS. That is one difference. And initially, at least, they have significantly better compliance, and that is primarily because of a ventilation perfusion defect. The ventilation perfusion defect is much more because the perfusion is affected much more in COVID rather than the infiltration of the alveoli. So once the COVID disease progresses, it behaves just like any ARDS. That is one. Then secondly, the practice of awake proning. The practice of awake proning has not been found to yield unequivocally positive results. The results, the trials have not shown any benefit as such for awake proning. The data is out, and we have been practicing. You can practice it, but it has not shown that awake proning actually does help. And that is because probably in the severe disease, you have to kind of manage with NIV and then intubate. And in the early stages, the disease is more of a ventilation problem. Yes, sir. Please carry on. I think you got disconnected.
Yeah, I got disconnected. So I think you continued with what I was saying. There may be a difference of opinion. I said that Gattinoni did come out with this, that high compliance ARDS in the initial stages, and later stages it was the same. But only thing is that we did not intubate these patients very easily. Easily means that we waited for long. We tried to manage them with high flow nasal cannula and NIV, sometime alternatively, and proning them. But once they were ventilated, the strategy that we used was as in any ARDS. Only thing, maybe we use lesser amount of PEEP in the beginning. That's about it.
I would just like to add one thing, like from CMC Vellore, I would agree with Dr. Kilani that initially, definitely the ARDS did have a higher compliance than normal, and but what we found, and which may come out in print next week sometime in the Mayo Clinic proceedings, is we found that patients who did not respond to NIV, like 3 to 5 days of NIV, increasing FiO2 requirements, those patients, if we delayed intubation, they did much worse in terms of
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah, totally
So,
agree. Totally
so
agree.
if they didn't show a response within 3 to 5 days, we would go ahead and intubate them, and our outcomes were as good as any other ARDS, severity. And we used, as Dr. Kilani said, for irrespective of the severity of ARDS, mild, moderate, or severe ARDS, we still started them on NIV. High flow we didn't
So,
use much because of the oxygen consumption. That was the only. It was slightly higher oxygen consumption, and we were going through difficult times, so we didn't actually use high flow as much. But it was NIV alternating with mask.
Dr. Chaco, I would like to come here, I'll just put across. When I said that we delayed intubation, normally classical teaching, if the PF ratio is less than 200, go and intubate, something like that. That was not followed. By no means I meant that you delay intubation so that the patient crashes.
Yeah.
And it is also true, and every expert and every intensivist agrees that over delay of intubation does leads to worse outcome. So you do try BiPAP judiciously. You do try, and we use helmet quite a bit, and it works much better. I don't think too many people are using, but helmet worked well with us. Alternating with high flow nasal cannula worked very well. That initial fear of spreading COVID by using BiPAP was not founded at all. So I totally agree with your point.
Sir, one thing is that these patients had a high respiratory drive, very high respiratory drive, most of these patients.
Yeah.
And there was a tendency, like you said, and ma'am has also said, for delayed or prolonged use of NIV. While we know in ARDS, after a few hours, if the patient is not improving, we generally have to intubate the patient because it leads to worse outcomes. Same has been endorsed by the Society of Critical Care Medicine in America and European Society. They have not made any specific recommendations for delayed intubation, though this has been the practice. So your comments on that, because if the patient is not improving, having a high respiratory rate, and he's going to get PCLI, that will further contribute to lung injury and maybe fibrosis later on.
No, there are few things, I would like, the discussion can go on. One thing was that NIV also gave rise to a lot of pneumothoraces in our experience, because when you give NIV, sometimes the volumes are too high, because NIV majority of time we are using pressure cycle. You give certain amount of pressure, and everybody believes that it was because of the high volumes which were being generated, because of the good compliance on the part of lung, that these people developed volute trauma also, and these people developed pneumothoraces also. So I think I was not understood well when I said delayed intubation. I didn't mean that you wait for too long and so that patient crashes. But only thing what I meant was that use the NIV judiciously, and I'm very sure about it. The clinical judgment of patient getting tired is extremely important. It's not the ABG which is important. It is your clinical judgment that excessive use of muscles, patient getting exhausted, the pattern of breathing, the abdominal breathing, patient getting perspiration. You don't have to look at the CO2 all the time. It's very important. And if at that moment, if your NIV is not helping, or despite NIV, it is, go and intubate. You will be doing the biggest disservice if your patient crashes under your nose.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, sir. Sir, then finally, sir, one question about your comments on awake proning. This was never there initially, and this has come into the vogue with COVID. But the data has been inconclusive. So your comments on awake proning in COVID and maybe in future for lung disease, mild respiratory failure.
So the awake proning is good at home. When we saw in April and May, there was shortage of oxygen. There were no oxygen cylinders. There was no oxygen concentrators. That is one part of it. So we are not discussing that. In hospital, we prone patients all the time on NIV, on high flow nasal cannula. but it's a procedure which works for a very short period of time. So whether it saves the patient, whether it improves the survival, or whether it is it reduces the chances of intubation, I'm not sure about. Maybe Dr. Thakur can share her experience on that.
Dr. Tapesh, definitely this is one situation where we found awake proning did help.
I think we lost her. So awake proning definitely does improve the oxygen saturation. There's no questions about it. But whether it improves the survival, I'm not sure.
I don't think it improves survival, definitely, but it did delay ventilation.
Yeah, sure.
Yes. Okay, ma'am. So those are the few things about the intensive care part of COVID ARDS, and sir has beautifully explained about the fibrosis and the way forward, and the so many complications we're getting in, especially pneumothorax and pneumomediastinum. And I think now we'll move on to the second part, that is the extrapulmonary complications of COVID, and the third part will be the treatment, the specific treatments of COVID. So we'll just move on to the second part. I'll share the screen. So am I visible, Dr. Chakor?
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Okay. So friends, the major brunt of the disease is borne by the lungs, as we all know. We'll talk about the extrapulmonary manifestations now. And these are the contents of my short talk now. So this is the iconic picture of the Spanish flu, and this is COVID now. So just to give you an idea of the progress that mankind, the scientific world, has made in medicine in 100 years. So there were 4 crore deaths in the Spanish flu, and as of now, from the data that is available, we have 45 lakh deaths and still counting. So these 4 crore deaths occurred with the backdrop of the population, world population of 1.7 billion, and today the population is 7 billion. So that is not, I think, a bad figure and a bad number. He seems to have done well in terms of progress in science. Now, a word about the etiopathogenesis. How does the virus invade and disseminate in the human body? So we have these virus particles here, and we have the spike protein, that is the S protein, and we have the host cell where the ACE2 receptor is fundamental. So the virus goes and binds to the receptor, and through the binding of the S protein to the ACE2 receptor, it internalizes and enters the respiratory epithelium first. And thereby it starts replicating in the lung tissue, it invades the other cells, and it disseminates to the entire body. And thereby the damage to the rest of the body depends on the genetic makeup of the host and is mediated through cytokine immune mediated or direct viral cytopathic effect and microthrombosis. Microthrombosis is one of the key features in the pathogenesis of this virus as opposed to the other viruses. Then just to take you briefly through a case. So this patient, typical case of COVID, and these were the investigations. As you can see, there's a lymphopenia, which is described as less than 1,000 and is a poor prognostic marker because the lymphocytes are destroyed in the immune process. And characteristically, platelets are normal. There's an elevation of PT-INR, LFT, KFT are normal. CRP is raised, ferritin is raised, D-dimer is raised, BNP is raised, and PROPA is raised. So he seems to be having cardiac injury also. And this is the X-ray showing bilateral fluffy shadows. And on CT, there is the characteristic peripheral distribution more than the other areas. And echo is done in view of the cardiac markers being elevated, and they show a EF of 25%, which has dropped from his previous baseline echoes. And there's global hypokinesia, reduced RV contractility, and obviously he has biventricular involvement. So the course in the ICU has a progressive downhill course. He's intubated and ventilated in terms of his status, and NORAD is started, and the BP is 100/60. He's on antibiotics, he's on steroids, he's on remdesivir, he's on toci, and he is diagnosed to have COVID ARDS now. And COVID ARDS, I think we have already discussed the main features of COVID ARDS, and I will not discuss COVID ARDS. Then he is in shock. Now, what are the causes of shock in a patient of COVID? It can be cardiogenic, as it is quite obvious here. Our patient is in biventricular failure or acute heart failure with biventricular dysfunction. Then there can be a cytokine storm. The cytokine storm itself can lead to hypotension. Then please don't forget, these patients are hypovolemic. These patients are hypovolemic because of high fevers. They often have diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, poor intake. And then, of course, you can have sepsis, which has not been so uncommon, especially with prolonged stay. They can get superimposed bacterial infections and sometimes fungal infections. So the cardiac manifestations of COVID, myocarditis, and our patient here obviously had myocarditis because he had significant acute drop in biventricular ejection fraction. And myocarditis, we know, has various cardiac manifestations in terms of its symptoms. Then there can be a thrombus. Thrombus can result in myocardial infarction or heart attack, and many patients are presented with heart attacks or myocardial infections. And then you can have pulmonary emboli. Then there can be arrhythmias, atrial fibrillation being the commonest. And classically, viral myocarditis, when it does occur, normally has fulminant tachyarrhythmias. But that was not the case here. The atrial fibrillation was the most common arrhythmias. And then you can have sudden cardiac death because of sudden pulmonary embolism, sudden myocardial infarction, sudden arrhythmias. So all these are the cardiac manifestations of COVID. Then coming to the course, day 3, the patient developed acute kidney injury and requiring dialysis. He developed altered sensorium. There was no focal neurological deficit, and he continued to remain febrile. Day 5, suddenly starts developing high-grade fever. The CRP becomes extremely high. There is worsening hypotension. The antibiotics are stepped up. Antifungals are added. MRI EEG is normal for his altered sensorium. And despite all these measures, there's nothing more that can be done, and he dies on day 10. Now, just to summarize, the patient had shock and he has multi-organ failure. He had ARDS, he had cardiogenic shock due to acute biventricular failure, and he had encephalopathy and acute kidney injury. So ARDS, I think I will not talk now, and acute biventricular failure, that is the cardiac complications I've covered. So we will move on. Now coming to the neurological manifestations. So as far as the neurological manifestations are concerned, encephalopathy and ischemic strokes, they constitute 90% of the neurological manifestations occurring in the ICU, and neurological manifestations are not so uncommon. The encephalopathy is a result of the systemic toxins, the systemic insults, just like any septic encephalopathy. Not much of a virus particle has been found in the brain in the autopsies in these patients dying of encephalopathy. And the encephalopathy often contributes to hyperactive delirium, hypoactive delirium, and of course, just the altered sensorium. They can go into deep coma. Then ischemic strokes actually occur in 1 to 2% of these patients, and they're not so common as was touted initially. At least in our country, strokes have not been that common. Then there are a host of other complications which can occur. A very small percent of patients, less than 1%, develop encephalitis. Now, encephalitis can be the typical viral encephalitis. In the viral encephalitis of these patients, the CSF remains normal. The PCR is normal, as well as the CSF analysis is by and large normal. What you do get is leptomeningeal enhancement. Then the other kinds of encephalitis is autoimmune encephalitis. You can get an autoimmune encephalitis in these patients, and you can also get acute demyelinating encephalitis. So when the patient is actually in altered sensorium and there's no obvious cause, it is important to kind of delineate the etiology of the altered sensorium, because autoimmune encephalitis and ADM, they have specific treatments which can respond to therapy. So it is important to get to the bottom of the cause of the neurological manifestations. And apart from this, there are a host of other involvements you can get. You can get peripheral involvement also, you can get GBS. These numbers in terms of percentages are very small, 0.01%, 0.001%. But because the prevalence of the disease is so high, they translate into meaningful numbers. Patients are presented with status epilepticus also. So please be cognizant of the varied neurological manifestations of COVID. They can have varied manifestations. The anosmia and the ageusia were also manifestations of neurological complications, with the nerves, the neural pathways involving taste and hearing getting involved. And just to take that forward, I would like to comment upon the phenomena of happy hypoxia. A lot of patients had happy hypoxia, meaning that they were having low saturations, but they were not dyspneic. So just to see the central diagram here, you can see this is the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is very important in conducting afferent and efferent impulses from the lungs to the brain and back. Now, the patient actually remained happy because of this. To understand that, what is dyspnea? Dyspnea is an unpleasant awareness of breathing. You become unpleasant while breathing. And that happens when there's a mismatch between the effort you are making to breathe and the oxygen you are getting. So these impulses have to be transmitted to the brain and back forth to the lungs. And then only you can feel that there's a mismatch between the effort you are making, the oxygen you are generating, and that leads to dyspnea. And because the vagal pathways were impacted and there was invasion in the brain also, that probably led to these patients having happy hypoxia. Maybe Dr. Khilnani would like to comment on this, the phenomena of happy hypoxia. Now, a word about cytokine storm. We all heard there was about cytokine storm in the beginning. Those cytokine storm, the patient has gone into cytokine storm. So where has cytokine storm gone? We don't talk about it anymore. Was it really there? And if it is there, what does it mean? So what is a cytokine storm? So cytokine storm was a phenomena first described in CAR T cell therapy in oncology. And it is a state of excessive stimulation of the immune system leading to excess cytokines. And it can be triggered by pathogens also. And the triggering of the pathogens, like by the coronavirus in our cases, upregulates the driver cells of the immune system and negatively downregulates the negative cells in the immune system. This together leads to immune hyperactivation. Then once this happens, there's a myriad of cytokines which are released, as you can see here, and thereby pathologically sustained cytokine production leading to excessive circulating cytokine levels, then acute systemic inflammatory effects, secondary organ dysfunction, and multi-organ failure. And your drugs I've highlighted act at various levels in these cytokine pathways, TOSI here, and glucocorticoids, and baricitinib, which we are also using now. It has come into the recommendations. So this is how the cytokine storm works, and it is very much there. So what is the diagnostic criteria for cytokine storm? It has to be acute in onset. There has to be fever, high inflammatory markers, ferritin, D dimers, interleukins, CRP, and there has to be severe organ damage. Now, what is meant by severe organ damage? Severe organ damage actually means organ damage beyond that caused by viral replication. When there is viral replication in the lungs, there is going to be some degree of inflammation. But when this goes beyond that, which can be caused by just viral replication, goes into severe ARDS or moderate ARDS, it becomes cytokine storm and progresses to the other organs. So these are the clinical manifestations of cytokine storm. You can see practically everything can occur. Practically everything can occur with a cytokine storm. The more severe the cytokine storm, more the organ involvement and more the damage. Now, is the cytokine storm in COVID actually just viral sepsis? So we all, don't use this term viral sepsis, but there is a lot of viral sepsis in the ICU. When we keep pumping in antibiotics and the patient does not respond, many a time it is viral sepsis. In fact, just to take that forward, in recent studies in pneumonia getting admitted to the ICUs, 20% has been found to be having viral community-acquired pneumonias. Now, this has been endorsed by the three major societies, the world societies, the global societies, that is the Society of Critical Care Medicine United States, the European Society of Intensive Care Medicine Europe, and the Global Sepsis Alliance, that the cytokine storm is nothing else but viral sepsis. So I think that should clarify things a little about what is cytokine storm, that it is actually viral sepsis that we are dealing with. Now, moving forwards to COVID-associated coagulopathy. Like Sher also showed that there is a significant microthrombosis in the lungs. One of the key features of the pathogenesis is the endotheliopathy. It injures the endothelium to a great extent, leading to endotheliopathy, and at the same time there's a hypercoagulable state because it upgrades the procoagulant factors. And in the lungs, when there is hypoxia further leads to endothelial damage and leads to a low blood flow state due to vasoconstriction, and this further damages the lungs. So the main concerns here are endothelial damage and a hypercoagulable state caused by COVID. As far as the platelets are concerned, the PT-APTT, the fibrinogen, the D dimers, they can be normal or they can be elevated. And when TEG has been done, TEG is a much more better way of analyzing your pathways for coagulation. It has shown shutdown of fibrinolysis. So that shows that there's a hypercoagulable state, and despite your PT being elevated, your PTT being elevated, you often get a mildly elevated PT-APTT. The state is one of hypercoagulability, and that just shows that your original test of PT-APTT do not really reflect well upon the coagulation status, as was first found out in liver disease. TEG is probably going to be the way forward because it reflects much better on the coagulation pathway. And one thing is, bleeding is not a feature of COVID. Unless the patient is bleeding because of your Clexane or whatever you have put him on, or it is end-stage disease, bleeding is not a feature of COVID. Now coming to infections. So as far as the infections is concerned, the data varies, but in a meta-analysis, it was seen that 14% incidence of bacterial infections and very few had infections at the outset. Though we have a tendency, and probably rightly, to start antibiotics at the outset in more severe cases, the data has shown that initially the incidence of bacterial infections is not so high, but as you stay longer and longer in the ICU, there's a progressive increase of bacterial infections, and the tune is 14%. Then very few have been found to actually have infections at the initial admission that I have told you. Most of the patients are already on antibiotics when we start them, and there are no real guidelines on the use of antibiotics. So antibiotics have to be used judiciously, and the clinical discernment has to be used in applying antibiotics. Then influenza, the CDC recommends that once the patient comes to the ICU, they should be started on antibiotics and then de-escalated or continued as per the evidence. But there are no recommendations for the use of antibiotics in COVID, and one needs to be aware of aspergillosis and mucor. So we all know about mucor, what happened in our country because of the hyperglycemia and because there was a predisposition towards mucor caused by the virus denuding the epithelium in the nasopharyngeal tract. And aspergillosis is a known complication of a prolonged stay on the ventilator in patients with pulmonary diseases, especially on steroids. So we have to be cognizant of these two diseases. And aspergillosis, if you want to pick up, often we don't do BAL because of aerosolization. Aspergillosis can be picked up by the galactomannan, serum galactomannan, and a value of more than 1 has been advocated for diagnosing aspergillosis. And mucor is not so difficult to pick up. Clinically, mucor causes a black eschar as it spreads. So rhinocerebral form can be picked up by looking at the patient. The black eschar is quite diagnostic. Then a word about procalcitonin, the use of procalcitonin in infections. So in COVID, initially, CRP is high, but procal is generally normal. I repeat, generally. Now, as the disease progresses, there can be mild fluctuations, but when there is a secondary infection, you look at the kinetics of procalcitonin, it will rise. The way to use actually procalcitonin is more to look at the kinetics than absolute values. So the procalcitonin rises somewhere in between. When the patient is deteriorating, you can probably assume there is a bacterial infection. Now the question here is, he may deteriorate because of the cytokine storm. So in cytokine storm, characteristically procalcitonin does not rise. So this is just to help you to decide about your antibiotics, the cause of deterioration. Now moving forward to the kidneys. So as far as the kidneys are concerned, the usual ICU factors can lead to kidney injury. You have your fluid retention, hemodynamic instability, your drugs, high levels of PEEP and interactions with lung and heart. Then cytokine elevations. Vascular consequences, that is your microthrombosis occurring in the nephron. And there can be invasion by the virus itself, leading to a direct viral cytopathic effect. There is overall a 10% incidence of acute kidney injury in the critically ill, and the hypertensives, the diabetics, the elderly have more severe disease. And ATN has been seen in these autopsies, so it is akin to a septic kidney. The overall picture is like a septic kidney, and ATN is the predominant lesion that has been found in the limited number of autopsies that have been done. Now coming to the GI manifestations, the gastrointestinal system is rich in the ACE2 receptors, and there's a heavy penetration by the virus in the GI system. Altered LFTs are common. Then you have acute acalculous cholecystitis, which can be difficult to diagnose, especially on the ventilator. Then Ogilvie syndrome, which is probably thought due to the viral nerve involvement leading to dilatation of the colon, the autonomic tone being damaged by the viral invasion. And then you have the dreaded complication of mesenteric ischemia. There's a higher incidence of mesenteric ischemia in these patients, probably because of the low flow states, the microthrombosis, the endotheliitis, which is occurring in the mesenteric vessels. Now, just coming to the last few slides, the endocrine effects. So if you look at this here, we found that there was a lot of new onset hypoglycemia, and the sugars went high in the diabetic patients, and there was a unusually high incidence of DKA and non-ketotic hyperosmolar coma. So the baseline RDS was shifted in all these patients, and even in the normal patients, there were patients who were never having any problems with the sugars who were found to be diabetic, and sugars went up with the onset of COVID, and there were these complications which I just told you. And now these patients have been followed at 6 months. 65% had returned to euglycemia in this study, and the others were at varying stages. So what was the reason for this hyperglycemia? One was that the insulin became deficient, and that was probably because the beta cells in the pancreas were damaged by the virus, though the receptors have not been found on the beta cells themselves. Then there was increased resistance, and of course there was the stress response during that period. Similarly, the other organs are also affected in the endocrine system, like the adrenals, the thyroid, to a lesser extent. Now, not to forget the skin. Skin is something which is a clue to the inner organs, and all kinds of rashes can occur with COVID, and this should not put you away from the diagnosis, or if you have the diagnosis, you should not think something else is happening. All kinds of rashes are compatible with your COVID. Now, the last slide is on long COVID. So, sir had talked about the post-COVID lung fibrosis, and long COVID is something which is very common. And if you see here, incidence of persistent symptoms up to 40 to 90%, and it is defined as symptoms beyond 12 weeks from the onset of illness. And as far as the proposed mechanisms are concerned, it is a prolonged inflammatory response, deconditioning, reinfections with other things, so on and so forth. So post-COVID is another thing, just like the post-COVID lung fibrosis, which is very much there. But please also remember that fever does not occur beyond 4 weeks of onset of illness. And if fever is occurring, then we have to think of something else. It is not the long COVID which is causing fever. So that is all about my talk on the extrapulmonary features of COVID. And these are some of the resources you can go to. I hope it was helpful. And I hope with the year 2002 to humanity, and we all will be much better off. Thank you. So if there are any questions or any comments, sir, from Kelani sir or ma'am, or we can just move forward.
No questions from my side. It was a very extensive talk covering all aspects. So.
Sir, anything you want to say, sir? Anything on happy hypoxia or anything else?
I can speak for 1 hour, but I like to listen to Dr. Binita.
Okay, sir. So then let's move forward. Ma'am, please carry on.
Yeah. Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yes, ma'am.
Is there
Yeah, fine. Carry on, please.
Me? Because there was an echo with my headphones.
It's kind of okay.
I can't hear you all actually.
You can't hear us?
Just
we
one
can
second.
hear you.
Okay, I think I'll use my headphones.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, all right. Okay, so Dr. Tapesh and Dr. Kilani have made my talk a lot easier by covering a lot of the aspects. So I'll skim through, and I'm sure many of us have already got bored of COVID, listening to many talks over the past couple of years almost. So when you look at the therapy for COVID, my focus is essentially going to be on medical management of COVID in the ICU. We will still probably be seeing COVID over the next 1 to 2 years till it dies a natural death. I think the essential thing to remember is the what stage of the disease the patient is in. That is what will guide your therapy. So if you look at the first initial stage of disease, the problem is with viral replication, and this is where actually there may be a role for antiviral therapy, antibodies, monoclonal antibodies, which one of the participants was asking about. I'll just very, very quickly take you through. I'm not sure whether there are any trainees, just to help you all understand the whole mechanism, why all these therapies were actually studied, because this may encourage you to pursue some research should a new virus come up. Okay, so this is the COVID virus, which fuses with the host cell membrane via the ACE2 receptors. And after cleavage by the transmembrane protease, there is endocytosis, and there's an endosome formation, which then gets broken down to viral polyproteins. Now, this gets further broken down by proteases to non-structural proteins. Then it gets broken down by RNA-dependent RNA polymerases to replicated RNA, and by transcription to structural proteins. All these together come together and they get assembled, and you have a mature virion which is formed, which then leaves the cell by exocytosis. So this entire pathophysiology has formed the basis of the therapies which were tried in SARS-CoV-2. So you've got the fusion inhibitors, the competitive inhibitors like chloroquine, which prevented the binding of the COVID virus to ACE2 receptors, drugs which increase the endosomal pH, thereby breaking down the endosome, and also protease inhibitors like lopinavir, darunavir, and sacubitril, all of which I've marked in red, which means it hasn't been shown to work. And you've got the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase inhibitors. That is, remdesivir is the only drug which has some benefit, not a mortality benefit, but time to recovery. And subsequently, as I mentioned, so in the initial stages, viral replication, antiviral therapy, and antibodies will help. But once the patient comes to ICU, severe illness or critical illness, that is the stage when inflammation is the predominant pathophysiology, and that is where actually anti-inflammatory agents actually come into play. So you can see here the viral polyproteins then merges with the host cell DNA with the help of these impotents, and that damages the host DNA and results in activation of the inflammatory cascade. All of you would have heard about ivermectin. It has not been shown to be useful. That acts via blocking this impotent and merging of the viral polyprotein with the host DNA. And the other immunomodulators come in here via the action on several aspects, on the interleukin-6, on the JAK-STAT pathways, which I'll be covering later. So essentially, the focus of therapy in COVID is antiviral therapy, which, as I said, helps in the early stages of COVID, not later on. Immunomodulators and anticoagulation with or without antiplatelets. This is all based on what we've heard from the previous speakers. Very quickly looking at antiviral therapy, remdesivir is the only antiviral therapy which has been shown to have some benefit. The first trial RCT which came out was the ACT-1 trial, where patients who had evidence of radiographic infiltrates, desaturation, or requirement of supplemental oxygen or mechanical ventilation were randomized to receive remdesivir and placebo. And the only group which was found to have benefit was the patients who were receiving oxygen. No other group had benefit in terms of time to recovery. So the only benefit was in terms of time to recovery. There was no mortality benefit. The time to recovery was much less in the group which received oxygen by mask, not in the group which received high flow oxygen or NIV, as you can see in this slide here. Subsequently, the WHO Solidarity trial came in, which also showed the same thing, that there was no mortality benefit, but there was a benefit in terms of decreased time to recovery in the group that was on oxygen, and no benefit if the patient was requiring NIV or high flow or mechanical ventilation. So if you're starting remdesivir, make sure it is started early. It's 200 milligrams stat dose, 100 milligrams BD for 4 days. And moving on to the anti-inflammatory drugs, you've got dexamethasone, the classic trial. The recovery trial fortunately came out early when we were in the first wave in India. And this trial actually showed a benefit. If you gave 6 milligrams IV OD for 10 days, there was a mortality benefit. And as Dr. Kilani said in his first presentation, there was a mortality benefit, and the benefit was most seen with dexamethasone, as you can see here, as compared to hydrocortisone or methylpred. So Dexa was the only drug which actually had a clear benefit in terms of mortality, followed by hydrocortisone and then methylprednisolone. The other anti-inflammatory agent or immunomodulator which has been looked at is tocilizumab. Now, tocilizumab has the interest came about initially last year, August, from a retrospective cohort study, which showed that the probability of mechanical ventilation and death was less in the group that was received tocilizumab, and then led on to a lot of randomized controlled trials, both outside ICU and inside ICU. Outside ICU, the only trial which showed benefit was the EMPACTA trial, which actually looked at mechanical ventilation or death as an outcome and found a benefit in favor of tocilizumab in patients outside the ICU in COVID pneumonia who were not receiving mechanical ventilation. But looking at trials within the ICU, I think the classic trials that one needs to know are the REMAP-CAP trial. Now that came out early this year, where they looked at adult patients within 24 hours of commencing organ support in the ICU. And what they looked at was comparing tocilizumab, 8 milligrams per kilogram, or sarilumab versus placebo. And the outcome that they looked at was a combined in-hospital mortality and days free of organ support to day 21. What they found was that there was a benefit in terms of organ support free days that they could see here. But this trial was flawed in that actually it was actually a fairly small trial and had a low fragility index, which meant that if 3 patients moved from one arm to the other, from tocilizumab to placebo, the outcome would be completely nullified. And hence this trial was not given that much of weightage as compared to the recovery collaborative study group, which brought about this huge sample size trial, 2,000 plus patients in both tocilizumab and usual care. And the outcome that they looked at was just mortality alone. And they found a clear benefit in terms of mortality in tocilizumab as compared to usual care. Now, in India, I think it was in SGPJ, I think this was a group which looked at adults with moderate to severe COVID disease, where they looked at the progression of COVID-19. And here they looked at a smaller dose of tocilizumab, 6 mg per kg versus placebo. What they found was there was no difference in terms of overall progression of COVID-19 in the entire group of patients, and no difference in secondary outcomes in terms of mortality. But when they looked at smaller subgroups, they found that in the patients with severe COVID, tocilizumab had less progression to critical as compared to placebo, but the study was not powered to look at this. But putting together all the studies on tocilizumab, there was finally an impact in terms of anti-IL-6 antagonists when they combined both the retrospective trials, the prospective trials. They found a benefit in favor of IL-6 antagonists and mortality. But the benefit was most seen with tocilizumab. And not just tocilizumab alone, tocilizumab in combination with corticosteroids in terms of decreasing 28-day mortality and in terms of decreasing progression to intermittent mandatory ventilation, ECMO, or death. Tocilizumab as compared to the other IL-6 antagonist was the one which found the benefit. Okay, so as a result of this, the many treatment guidelines across the world have recommended a single IV dose of tocilizumab in patients who are on dexamethasone. So 8 mg per kilogram of the actual body weight, but it should not exceed 800 milligrams. A repeat dose of 8 mg per kg can be given if there is no improvement, but that is not like a standard recommendation. One dose is what most guidelines would say. But you must be careful to avoid tocilizumab in patients with immunosuppression, who have liver enzyme derangement more than 5 times the normal, uncontrolled infections, low neutrophil count less than 500, low platelet counts less than 50,000, and if they have a high risk of GI bleeding, avoid tocilizumab. Moving on to the next anti-inflammatory agent, immunomodulator, is baricitinib. Now, this was a big study, which was the ACT-2 trial, which came out this year, March, where they looked at all hospitalized patients with COVID-19. Now, just to show you where it acts, so as I mentioned here, tocilizumab is an IL-6 antagonist. SARS-CoV-2 will induce a massive release of cytokines, and some of them act via the IL-6 receptors, and some act on the JAK-STAT pathway. So you need to have the JAK-STAT inhibitors as well, which is where baricitinib and other inhibs come into place. But baricitinib is the drug which I'm talking about right now. There was no mortality benefit, but again here they found that the time to recovery was better, but this was in one group higher. So the group that was requiring NIV and high flow nasal, the time to recovery was better in the group in the baricitinib arm in combination with remdesivir. So what the recommendation state is that you consider baricitinib 4 milligrams once daily for 14 days if tocilizumab cannot be given and the patient requires increasing oxygen flows more than 40% with evidence of systemic inflammation. So all this should be given. Don't give both together, and you should avoid the tocilizumab baricitinib combination because it can predispose the patient to a higher risk of infection, and it is not recommended if creat clearance is less than 30 ml per minute body surface area. The COVE barrier trial also looked at baricitinib in patients with COVID-19, where they looked at hospitalized adults with COVID disease with at least one elevated inflammatory marker. Here they defined it as a CRP more than 65, and they looked at the proportion of patients going on to require high flow nasal, NIV, invasive ventilation, or death by day 28. This was a fairly big study. 700 or close to 1,500 patients were recruited. In this study, you can see majority of the patients, 80%, received glucocorticoids, and only by that time the hype and remdesivir had come down, so only 1/5 of the patients received remdesivir. And what they found was that there was no actual impact in terms of mortality, but again here in the group that required NIV or high flow oxygen devices, you can see that there is a mortality benefit actually in patients who received baricitinib, and this was in combination with glucocorticoids. But the same guidelines hold true. Please do not combine baricitinib with tocilizumab. So remdesivir early, if at all. Dexamethasone in patients who require oxygen support. There's no benefit if patients are not on oxygen support. And baricitinib also can be considered in patients who have got increasing oxygen requirements with evidence of an inflammatory markers, but do not use it in combination with tocilizumab. Antithrombotic agents. The theory behind it is because you have an increased risk of venous thromboembolism as high as 1 in 3, with a much higher risk of thromboembolism in ICU patients, and post-mortem studies showing microvascular thrombosis. In fact, this was mentioned in Dr. Kilani's talk as well. Platelet fibrin thrombi were found in close to 60 to 70% of patients in a post-mortem study. And so there's a lot of interest in antithrombotic therapy. As of now, what we know is the big trial published in NEJM, which shows that in critically ill patients, the harm is probably more than the benefit, because they found that the trial was actually stopped early because there was no benefit in terms of organ support free days. However, in moderately ill patients, so patients in the ward, they found that therapeutic anticoagulation may decrease ventilatory and organ support. So this was the study which came out just maybe a month back. Therapeutic anticoagulation with heparin, the REMAP-CAP, Active-4, and the ATTACK investigators. So they have actually said no. As I mentioned, the study was stopped early because of the organ support free days were much lower in therapeutic dose anticoagulation as compared to usual thromboprophylaxis. But I'd like to draw your attention here that the major thrombotic events were much less in the therapeutic dose anticoagulation as compared to usual care. So what we follow here in CMC is still we do follow therapeutic anticoagulation for patients with high D-dimer if there are no contraindications. As of now, we've managed close to almost 1,500, 2,000 patients in the ICU, and the bleeding risk is very minimal as long as the patients are closely monitored, and we use therapeutic anticoagulation for at least a minimum period of 14 days followed by prophylactic anticoagulation. So even if you're not using therapeutic anticoagulation, please make sure that patients are receiving anticoagulation preferably intermediate dose at least in the ICU patients. Now, we're looking at plasma therapy. There is definitely no role. The PLACID trial, which was a big trial done in India, found no role of convalescent plasma. And remember, as I mentioned earlier, plasma therapy, if at all, will have a role if it's put early. No point in the ICU. Plasma exchange is under study, and it may have benefit as a rescue role. I mean, there are a lot of studies which are going on right now, which have shown that if you do plasma exchange, there may be benefit as evidence from retrospective cohorts. Now, someone was asking in the chat about monoclonal antibodies. This I have just put it as the big trial which came out first, but there are a lot of other trials which have come up in NEJM on outpatient basis. Remember what I said earlier: antibodies will be effective to target viral replication. Okay, so early in the disease. In ICU setting, definitely no role. Okay, so early in the disease, in patients, the benefit is seen more in patients who are seronegative. You can see here, this is the seronegative arm, and the REGEN-COV, which was a combination of casirivimab and imdevimab, and that found a benefit in the seronegative. In the seropositive, no point. So if patients are seronegative, early on in the disease, it's okay to give them a single dose of this combination. There are several monoclonal antibodies which have come up, and the evidence is still not completely in favor of these monoclonal antibodies, but if at all, it is recommended to be used in mild and moderate disease early and in an outpatient setting. This trial was published recently in NEJM, which shows no role of neutralizing monoclonal antibody. This is the antibody which was studied in hospitalized patients. So again, outpatient basis, there may be a role in decreasing mortality in the patients who are seronegative. Now, a lot of drugs have been studied. I think the number of therapies which have been studied in COVID have been tremendous. And what I've highlighted sorry. I think it's gone off, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, I'll just, yeah. Okay, number of studies which have been done on lots of drugs, and you can see here that the areas which I've put in red are the drugs which have been shown to have some benefit. Corticosteroids in patients requiring oxygen, tocilizumab in patients who have rapid respiratory deterioration despite being on steroids, JAK inhibitors, that is your baricitinib, in patients who are on dexamethasone and remdesivir, but in patients, you must make sure that they shouldn't have received tocilizumab, and remdesivir in decreasing your time to recovery in patients who are on oxygen. No real benefit in patients in the ICU. All of the other studies, all of the other drugs that you can see here have not been shown to be useful. And I've seen all these combination of drugs in patients in the ICU. As of now, evidence-based practices do not support any of these drugs on routine basis. And also this drug, the 2-deoxy D-glucose, also is based on small phase 3 trials, and there is no real peer-reviewed article, and the design and statistical analysis is not clear. I think one of the most important things, in addition to ventilation and optimal medical therapy in the form of steroids, tocilizumab if indicated, and maybe remdesivir early, it is very important that you have a conservative fluids approach to patients, because we found that actually helps a lot of patients in improving their lung function and decreasing ventilation duration. We actually keep our patients bone dry, and it really helps. Empirical antibiotics, is there a role? Actually, it's not routinely administered because bacterial superinfection does not have a prominent feature, but you may still administer antibiotics to patients in the ICU because it's very difficult to distinguish whether the patient could have a bacterial pneumonia. Very important that when patients do come to ICU, you must attempt to make a microbial diagnosis, either in form of sputum or endotracheal gram stain, urinary antigen testing, and de-escalate antibiotics if not indicated. So as I mentioned earlier, these are the only treatments which have been found to be useful. Anti-inflammatory therapy, dexamethasone 6 mg IV OD. This is in the ICU, I'm talking about in the ICU. If there's clinical deterioration despite being on steroids, you can consider tocilizumab or baricitinib, not both in combination. And there's a limited role of remdesivir in the ICU, probably a role early on before they come to ICU, and make sure that your patients are on anticoagulation. We prefer therapeutic. Evidence does not support it, but at least put them on intermediate dose anticoagulation. Thank you. One second. I'll stop sharing. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chapman, for that succinct description and summary of the treatment modalities. And I think we have answered the question. Criteria of using TOSI and doses, ma'am. One question. Criteria for using TOSI and doses.
Yeah, I think that has already been covered in the session. In terms of using it, if the patients do not have who have rapid respiratory deterioration, so suppose you have a patient in the ward, rapid respiratory deterioration, patient is on steroids, please make sure that you use it early if at all, but be cautious and keep in mind the contraindications to using tocilizumab. We generally advocate a single dose of tocilizumab. We do not give double dose because we've actually found a problem with secondary infections in the patients who have received a second dose of tocilizumab. If they've not responded with one, giving them a second dose does not help. I'm not sure what you would say about that.
Sir, you want to comment on doses, sir? Second dose, etc.
No, first I want to comment on what a wonderful capsule Dr. Chacko has given in a very short period of time. I think we ate into her time, but what she covered in 20 minutes is much more than what we actually spoke. So thank you very much, Dr. Chacko. And other thing, only one thing I want to say that we, like anybody, we use tocilizumab right from the beginning. But IL-6 level did not help us. What helped us was the clinical deterioration and CRP. These were the two parameters, and besides lymphopenia and some other things. But CRP was the one, along with the clinical deterioration, including hypoxemia, which made me to take a call on tocilizumab. That's what I was.
Right. Ma'am,
IL-6 in my practice I found most unreliable parameter. It is partly because of the technique that you use or what laboratory parameter, techniques that you use for measuring it. It was totally haywire and not correlating with the clinical.
Yeah, I would agree because this IL-6 levels in COVID ARDS have been shown all across the world to be much lower than any other ARDS. So IL-6 does not correlate with this need for starting tocilizumab, and one should not wait for those levels. I think a CRP is more than enough.
Right. Ma'am, then I think you covered monoclonal antibodies, but just to reiterate the question, what is the role of monoclonal antibodies? How much to give, can it be repeated, and its side effects? So if you can just answer that again.
Yeah, so there are a lot of monoclonal antibodies. If you look up Medscape, you'll see a big bunch of names which are difficult to pronounce. And I won't even trying to pronounce some of them. I don't use them in my practice. But as I said, if at all it is being used, use it early. It can be used in an outpatient setting in seronegative patients. This combination of Regenco, which is a equal dose of those two drugs, is given as a single IV or subcut injection. A repeat dose can be given after 4 weeks if the patient continues to be seronegative. And similarly, the other drugs have different prescriptions, and different dosings have also been tried: high dose, low dose, 600 milligrams versus 2.4 and 8 grams. Multiple doses have been tried, which you can get very easily on UpToDate. And I think the thing to watch out for will be anaphylaxis. Any antibodies, you're watching out for anaphylaxis. So those are things to patients with high risk of allergy may be more cautious with giving monoclonal antibodies.
Thank you, ma'am. There are no more questions, so I would request Dr. Khilani sir to sum it up before we end the session.
So, Tapesh always give me this thing. I actually don't have to. I spoke for a longer time than allotted to me. So first, my apologies for that. Second thing is that I would go a little philosophical. COVID taught us a lot of things, and evidence is very important, and evidence was coming each day and every day, and we must have caused harm also by using supranormal doses of corticosteroids at times using things which were not of much use. But clinical critical care,
medicine. An optimum supportive care, be it oxygenation, be it moderate doses of corticosteroids, be it judicious use of antibiotics, diagnosing infections at the right time, diagnosing fungal infections at the right time by using beta-glucan or galactomannan or having high index of suspicion. What it taught us, we are working in a teaching institution like Dr. Chako, we are always against using expensive things like CT scan, which has a radiation hazard. But in COVID, we realized that CT was a boon. Early use of CT scan or maybe sometime judicious use of CT scan was very, very helpful in our setting. And I need to apologize, Tapesh. There's another meeting at 7. I need to log off and get on to another. So thank you very much. And Dr. Chako, it was a pleasure listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
I'll also have to leave the page. It's been a long.
Yeah, it's time anyway. 7 o'clock. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Kilani, sir. Once again, thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. So with that, we'll log off. And thanks, Cipla, for providing the support for the video communications. Thank you, Cipla.